Hi, it's Pastor Andy. Welcome back for the 14th episode, addressing the topic of Jesus. Who do you say that I am? We're looking today at the Jesus that we find in portrayed in Matthew and Luke. Matthew and Luke are aware of Mark's Gospels. They come upon Mark's Gospel, and they decide independently of each other that they would like to take Mark's Gospel, but then fill it out. As we know, Mark's Gospel is bare bones, it's rough and ready, and Matthew and Luke both want to take it and say what they can do to it to make it perhaps more meaningful to their audiences that they were writing it for, to include things that they knew or they had discovered about Jesus that had been left out of Mark. And that's not surprising, since Jesus' ministry would have been between 1 and 3 years. There's probably a lot of things that people could have left out. Even Matthew and Luke are not exhaustive recounts, but each of them have their own specific reasons for writing and their perspective. So I want to go through those with you and describe the Jesus that you're most likely to get when you read their gospel, the Jesus you're most likely to understand. The first is Matthew. In Matthew's gospel, he really appreciates Mark's. He takes almost 100% of the written material of Mark's gospel and puts it full into his. It's plagiarism to the 9th degree. But then he organizes it in a way that meets his own goals and tries to structure it in a way that he feels will be more meaningful to his particular community. We think that the legend of it being written by Matthew, the tax collector, could be true. A tax collector might have had the additional literacy that probably fishermen didn't have, and perhaps that's where it came from. Others who look at this gospel think perhaps someone who was more trained in scribal tradition than a tax collector would have been, because there's a lot of that kind of feeling to this, a scribe for the kingdom, a scribe of Christianity instead of a scribe of Judaism. Where was it written? Probably a kind of cosmopolitan Jewish Gentile community like Antioch was where they were first called Christians. The date would have been between 80 and 90 AD, so after Mark, of course, but also maybe some time has gone by in the reflection of Jesus' stories, the processing of the stories that gives us an idea that it took place a little later. What's the goal that Matthew seems to have to taking Mark's gospel and enhancing it? He really wants to share with you the understanding of Jesus as the fulfiller. The fulfiller. He's the fulfiller of the law. In his teaching, we get the full meaning of what the law, that is the guidance of God, is really about and for. The Sermon on the Mount is the par excellence example of that, where Jesus goes up like Moses to the mount and takes even the commandments and shares them in such a way, he says, not to put them aside, but to fulfill them. And that means really for Jesus to get to the spirit of the law that may have been lost in more recent expressions of faith, less worried about the jot and the tittle and the dotted I and the crossed T, rather the spirit, the heart of the law. So Jesus oftentimes makes the law more mercifully, oftentimes makes it harder, but in any case, he doesn't come to abolish, he says, but to fulfill it. So we see Jesus kind of as a Moses character for the Christian community. Also, he is the fulfillment of prophecy. And this is why we see that scribal quality to Matthew, is that he knows the Old Testament, and he often introduces into the stories of Jesus those times where Jesus is fulfilling those prophecies, so that we get this great continuity from the Old to the New Testament. Matthew's not a gospel that you could read without being touched by the witness of the Old Testament. It doesn't. It needs the Old Testament so that you need to know what the promise was so that you know what the fulfillment is. And so he fulfills the law. He makes it deeper, richer. He's a teacher. He's a lawgiver like Moses. And yet he's also himself the one who, by his actions, getting baptized, going to the cross, these fulfill various Old Testament prophecies, and Matthew shares those with us. Matthew has some things that are special about his gospel that we don't see elsewhere, and it's always interesting to point that out. One is his genealogy begins with Abraham. It begins with Abraham. Jesus descends from Abraham. That's as far back as he goes. We have the stories of Jesus' birth, and Joseph is the key figure in that, whereas for many of us, we understand the story centering around Mary as it does in Luke's gospel. We have in the early stories the arrival of wise men. This is foretold. This is another example of fulfillment. And his escape to Egypt is also a fulfillment as he returns out of Egypt, just as the people of God returned from their slavery in Egypt to the promised land. We also see something that gives us another clue on Matthew's interest. He reads Mark and he doesn't find something that he's really looking for. And that is a sense of what it means to be a group of followers of Jesus who are still waiting a generation or more for him to return. It was easy in that first generation to think he's going to come back any minute. And so to focus just on sharing, and living as best you could, not really worried about getting a whole lifestyle and structure and organization together. But we see in this gospel a real sense that we need it. He hasn't come back yet. We're waiting. In the meantime, there's the church. And indeed, we could say in some ways that Matthew is the church's gospel. It's one reason they probably put it as the first of the gospels, even though it wasn't written first. How do we see these hints? Well, Peter figures in predominantly. Peter as the rock on which the church will be built. The word church is used in Matthew in its first time. Peter, who was bold enough to walk on water. And Peter is one who figures prominently in here. And then indeed the disciples are far less clueless in Matthew than they are in Mark. Sadly, the Jews are far less curious and mostly condemning. And we have to say that Matthew's gospel, unfortunately, misused, has committed, unfortunately, to a lot of anti-Semitism over the years, something to guard against. So we have Matthew's gospel, longer, 28 chapters, a lot more information, very comprehensive, uses almost all of Mark, has some special material, but real key in this, that Sermon on the Mount. And other times, there are 5 where there are extended Matthew times where Jesus talks. They call them discourses. The missionary discourse about what it means to go out and do missionary activity was something that would have meant a lot to Matthew's church. The parables of the kingdom as a sequence, a community discourse about what it's like to do life together, and then the eschatological discourse, which is what are the end times like. Matthew has the little apocalypse, which talks about the end times. Matthew then. Jesus in Matthew, Jesus is the fulfiller of the promise. He's the lawgiver, a new lawgiver in the line of Moses. He is one who founds the church. Now let's look at Luke real quickly, and I know I'm going faster even than usual. Luke, as far as we would understand, was probably a companion of Paul, mentioned as Luke the physician. Even scholars that are maybe more critical of the designations of Matthew, John, and Mark seem to be more comfortable with seeing Luke. Now, Luke wasn't an eyewitness. He was a person with Paul who had some sense of apostle nature to him, although he wasn't an eyewitness of Jesus either. So removed from the situation, and Luke doesn't pretend he was there. Luke starts off very clearly saying, here, I am going to gather up the information about Jesus, and I'm going to do it for a particular reason. I want you, a man he calls Theophilus, I want you, Theophilus, to be able to have at hand what you have come to be told. Um, was there a real Theophilus, or was this sort of a device that Luke used? Theophilus means lover of God. Maybe Luke is writing for all God lovers at that time that would be able to flesh out the faith that they had been given. It's very easy to say Jesus is risen, but tell me about this Jesus. Who was he? Where did he live? What did he do? Why is that important to me? Why should I care? What does it mean? So from the earliest church's gospel, which was enough to say that Jesus you met has been raised again, now you've got generations that don't know Jesus, didn't know him. Why is it important that he was risen? Luke's goal is to give them the information that they need so that that belief will be fleshed out. Probably written outside Palestine because Luke doesn't seem to understand the geography. Around 80 or 90. He uses about 50% of Mark and a little less enamored of Mark, and has an interesting group of his own particular inclusions. These are either stories he learned in his historical research, his journalism that he undertook to tell the story, or stories that were shared to him perhaps by Paul. Perhaps they were stories that were at communities he visited. We've got the Theophilus introduction, which is also repeated in the most amazing thing of all. Luke writes a sequel, the book of Acts. That is also given to Theophilus for greater faith and also, of course, to give a description of the roots of the church. We have the Mary stories, of course, her birth, her visit to Elizabeth, the birth of the announcement of Jesus, the birth of story, and all the things tied to Mary. Even about John the Baptist's child prediction, birth, that's fascinating. The genealogy doesn't go back to Abraham. It goes back to Adam. Why? Luke's writing for a Gentile audience. They don't identify Abraham as their father and Sarah as their mother. They could be convinced that they all come from Adam and Eve, and that's where the process begins. This Jesus goes back with you to the very beginning. Jesus is a little bit more about his background, that he's presented in the temple, and there's two people there that have things to say about that. He is left behind on a trip at the age of 12 in Jerusalem, and he teaches in the temple. So we'll get a little bit more personal about Jesus. And that seems to be something that Luke really sought, was to show Jesus as a man among people, and caring about people. For Luke, there's clearly, for Luke's Jesus, there's clearly concern for the poor. Certainly a strong respect for an inclusion of women, Mary and Martha being the foremost. He is rejected by Samaritans, but conversely portrays them in positive lights, most notably in the treasure of treasures gift of the Good Samaritan, which is only found in Luke. If it was a story that existed, a Jew like Matthew was not interested in sharing it, but a Gentile like Luke, who may have himself felt a little bit out of that club, really held on to that. And speaking of being left out, if you're looking to feel like there's a place for you in this kingdom, Luke's the gospel because he cares about the lost coin and the lost son and the lost sheep. He cares about the lost. The story of the so-called prodigal son is really the story of someone who's lost being found, and something that is a treasure today only found in Luke's gospel. And so Luke's gospel has so much for us, and it really concludes for us with many titles: the Messiah, the Son of Man, a prophet like Moses, the suffering servant Elijah, or a Greek philosopher, a Hellenistic immortal, or a Roman benefactor. All these titles fit Luke, and I hope that they will all be a blessing to you.